Hello BookTube, Books with Banks back again with another video. Today I've got another ranking video for you guys. The first ranking video I did was of a series I read everything in. This time I'm going to do one that I'm actually pretty new to. I've only read about 5 novels that have come out in this series, and I've read one novella and a couple short stories, and that is of course Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere Series. This is just the collection of short stories and novellas. I've only read a few of these, but everything else in the stack I'm going to be pulling from here are full novels that I've read. So I'll go, before I do my ranking of what I've read so far, I'll go into a little detail about how I came to the series, and I'll talk about kind of my reactions to these books as I was reading them. Real quick, before we get too much into the ranking, quick insert here just to say this is going to be very, very light spoilers. I might mention the name of a character who appears or has a prominent storyline in a later book in a trilogy here, but I'm not going to say anything that happens. I'm not going to talk about big deaths, or I'm not going to give away any twist reveals. Just want to make sure everybody is ready for the lightest of spoilers. I hope I don't ruin anything for people by making any of these videos. If you're going to experience all of these stories, I would much rather Brandon Sanderson be the one to deliver all of the big shocks and not just me, some random guy on YouTube. Thanks, and enjoy the video. So I have a friend an older friend from high school, and he really got into like Stormlight Archive. He read some of the Mistborn stuff. I'm pretty sure by this point today, he's caught up with all things Cosmere. He knew I was a big fantasy fan, and so he recommended that I start with maybe Warbreaker, maybe the first Mistborn book, kind of those typical recommendations for beginning anyone's journey in the Cosmere. And you know, I love books, and I was at Barnes & Noble one day, and so I just kind of got a bunch of the different options for jumping off points with Sanderson's Cosmere. And then they sat on my shelf for a little while, and were always kind of in a TBR, but always maybe pushed to the side just because I hadn't started them, and it was such a big series, you know, comprised of even smaller sub-series and some standalones, and I just was never particularly motivated to really dive in until I stacked up like 3 or 4 books on my shelf, and I said, hey, girlfriend, she was my girlfriend at the time, we're engaged now, but I said, which of these books should I read next? And she read the backs, and she said, this one looks really, really good. And that book was Elantris. And I said, that's actually interesting. That's Brandon Sanderson's first published novel that is part of the Cosmere world. And I dove in. This was probably, I guess this was winter 2020. Yeah, winter 2020 that I read this. I really like this book. I thought it was a little more straightforward than a lot of the other fantasy that I had been reading, but I really admired how organized and how tightly plotted Sanderson wrote this. I also really enjoyed the hints of kind of analyzing faith and religion in this book. I think he gets a little better at exploring those ideas in some of the other stuff I read by him. But yeah, I was pretty hooked by this book. I do think that the premise and the concept of this world is a little more enticing than the actual plot of, you know, all of the events that unfold. Whereas I think maybe the reverse could be said for some of his other books, but I really did like this, and it got me just that very next, like, January, February, to dive right on into the Mistborn Trilogy, Era 1. I took a while getting through the first book. I think it was like I wanted to read this because I knew people talked a lot about the Cosmere and Sanderson on BookTube, and I really wanted to kind of know a little more about it and I wanted to maybe fit in with the community just a little better. So this might have been one of those points in time when I was forcing myself through a book a little bit. But there is a lot to love here for anyone who hasn't read any of these. This book it reads a little bit like it has the tropes of a YA novel, which I think is actually I think that makes it approachable for a wide range of ages, but it also has very sophisticated ideas about, um, again, things about religion, and it introduces world building elements that sort of might just seem like throwaway lines in this book or throwaway details that are interesting, but maybe they're just texture. Who really cares? And then I think where this series really picks off is both book 2 and 3. I love these. Like, I finally getting to these, the third and fourth books that I was reading by Sanderson now. I got it. I understood the love and why people were so crazy about the Cosmere and Mr. Sanderson. So yeah, that's Well of Ascension and Hero of Ages. They blew me away, particularly this one. Not to spoil my ranking too much, but yes, I really loved both of these books. Then I remembered that I had gotten for that friend I had mentioned who was really kind of asking me, trying to get me into the series way back when. I had, for his birthday, I knew which books he had, and I knew he didn't have this collection of novellas and short stories, and so I got this for him. I decided, okay, I'm gonna go run out and buy that to see if what I've read so far, if any of the stories in here fit in chronologically with those, if there's anything I can read in here without being spoiled. And so I read, kind of while I was reading the first era Mistborn Trilogy, I read Emperor's Soul, which is the first novella here. I love that. Beautiful, beautiful story. Really great ideas about what is a person, what makes someone unique, what makes them an individual, how is a person's identity sort of an artistic expression, or how can it be expressed artistically? It's kind of a hard concept to explain, but if you've read the story, then I think you'll see how I'm trying to explain it, and still being pretty vague, trying to avoid spoilers, But yeah, so I read that. Then also there's like the Hope of Elantris is in here, and that is, I thought it was fine. It was just kind of extra filler information, kind of about what's going on in the climax of the Book of Elantris. Thought it was fine. And then by the time I finished the first era of Mistborn, I read the 11th Metal short story in here. From what I understand, there are still, even with the limited amount of books I've read in this universe, there are still a number of stories in here, like Sixth of the Dusk, I believe, is one of them, and then Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. It's called something like that. That's in here. I believe I can read those without spoiling any Stormlight or Mistborn Era 2, but I think I'm waiting to see if maybe when I'm reading some of those other bigger books, if I kind of hit a lull and I lose momentum, I can maybe take a break from those main bigger series to dive into one of these shorter things, still keep it all in world, keep my interest a little bit locked into Brandon Sanderson, but just take a break from some of the heavier stuff with what's in here. So yeah, I've only read just what I've read of this is pretty much like just the beginning chunks. Not that much at all. Yeah, like just about that much of this book. And I enjoyed it all so far. I look forward to what I read next. I'll rank that here in a moment, too, the 3 things I read in here, even though it might be a little unfair sometimes to rank novellas next to novels, and especially short stories next to novels, but I'll give it a go just to add a few more items to the ranking list. And then, finally, just recently, just this last June, end of June, beginning of July, I read Warbreaker. Now, this is the most recent book I've read, and this is the last of the ones I've read so far. So I enjoyed this world, not quite as much as the worlds of Elantris or the Mistborn world, but I liked it. I really loved one half of the storyline in here. It basically, it's a book that follows two sisters. There's one sister kind of in the palace, and there's a character named Lightsong, and there's this God King sort of character. Everything there, especially what's going on with Lightsong, I thought was fantastic. I ate it up. Possibly some of my favorite Sanderson stuff I've ever read. Again, that's probably the stuff that's a little heavier on themes of belief and faith and religion and what does worship look like? What do the worshipped owe their worshippers? These really kind of heavy questions. That's all in one half of it. The other half is more like thieving, city, assassin, intrigue, stuff that is honestly not my biggest draw, which might be why I'm not the biggest fan of some of the like team plotting, heist plotting dynamics of like the first Mistborn book. A lot of what's in that book reminded me of what one of the sisters is dealing with in this one. But then I think the end works really, really well for the half of the story that I love. I feel like certain connections and certain twists and things and characters' identities were all of a sudden much bigger or different than who you thought they were, but who they wound up being, at least in my opinion, I was a little fuzzy on the lore of the world for those reveals to have too much of an impact on me. So this is probably my most kind of mixed reaction. I didn't totally love it, even though I really loved elements of it, one half of the story basically. And I didn't totally dislike it, but I did find some of it a little bit slow and a little bit kind of retreading things that were a little too similar. Again, though, this, like all of the other things I've read of his so far, super tightly plotted, very organized. Just when things are slowing down, I felt like, all of these, he found a way to bring us back to either a character we've been missing for a while, but he's kind of pulled the wool over our eyes, and made us forget that we've even been missing them for that long. So yeah, that he does that here. He does that in all of these books. And now I'm gonna rank what I've read so far. So I think the worst one, it's still a great book, or a great story, but it is gonna be The Hope of Elantris. The short story here that is sort of epilogue / side chapter thing that happens chronologically near the end of the Elantris novel. It's fine. It adds an interesting kind of layer of, I wonder how these characters survive at the end of the book and exactly what went into them making it out alive, even though you could kind of in your head put some of those pieces together and assume that things worked out okay for that group of characters. But this short story, it's nice, but it's probably the least kind of special thing I've read of Sanderson's. And then, so that's in last place. Then second to last place, we've got... then second to last place, we've got The 11th Metal, another short story in here. This adds just a little bit of backstory to the Kelsier character from the Mistborn Trilogy, and I thought it was fine. I like the mechanics of the magic in that world, even though I'm not the biggest fan of reading like moment by moment action sequences. Like, then he bent his knee a little bit this way and then gripped with his hand like that and then bent this way and leaned just a bit. And when action sequences get into kind of the minutia of exactly all the movements and stuff, I'm not the biggest fan, and some of the Mistborn combat reads a little bit like that to me. But yeah, so I think that's why, even though I like the magic system, I like the character, that's why that short story still doesn't really kind of escape that shorter, less impactful status for me. So now I'm actually gonna set this aside for a second. I still have one more story in here to talk about, but I think I guess let's see, what places do I have? In sixth place, I'm gonna rank the first Mistborn Era 1 novel, which I believe in some regions around the world is published as The Final Empire. Again, I like this and I like the introduction to this world, but I'm not the biggest fan of the heist kind of team genre. I enjoyed the ballroom scenes. Those were some of my favorites, and I like what we get of one of the characters in those scenes that Ben meets, who becomes kind of one of the main characters of the whole series. In this one, he's really, really just a side character. And I liked Vin okay here. I think she becomes a much stronger protagonist in the later two books. But I also liked the mystery, and I liked how it was delivered to us. I liked the little bits of lore, where all of that's delivered, how the specific wording and the way that all of it works kind of plays into the conclusion. I thought that was really, really smart. And I think there's a fantastic action sequence in kind of climactic moment before the real end of the book that happens where it's a very sad scene, but it's very, very intense, and I think anyone who's read it probably knows the moment I'm talking about. They're in a square, kind of, and people are looking down from the rooftops, and someone steps in to try and stop something. Really good stuff, just not my favorite of his worlds. Definitely not the best of this trilogy. So that's sixth place. Then fifth place, I'm gonna have to say, is Elantris. I do maybe give this a little more credit than some people might, because it was the first one I read. I really enjoy it. I think the whole concept of the city, this fallen city of gods, kind of, and they're sick, and they have no purpose, and all they really know is pain, and pain's building on pains, and all of it just builds into this miserable sort of hellish place. And then for just people being human and being themselves and connecting, for that to be part of the kind of the momentum here, to be part of the plot, the storyline that picks up, or that starts moving things in a better, a more optimistic direction. I think it's a really nice message. Like, it's a really powerful story. So yeah, I'm gonna rank that definitely in fifth place. Then I'll say I'm gonna put Warbreaker in fourth place. Even though I think there are things about this book and the magic system and one of the two main characters, one of their storylines that I might like less than Elantris. I think the highs of this, mainly Lightsong's story, the God King and the princess, the sister that is with him, that story is fantastic. And it is so much better than Elantris that I can't resist putting this below it. Again, I think this really asks a lot of important questions about why people worship certain deities, how much power those deities have, how much responsibility a powerful figure in any society, whether they're godlike or maybe they're just a politician or something, how much responsibility those people have to their followers. And there's also interesting conversations about what is warmongering, what is just protecting your nation. Really good stuff in here. The magic is interesting. I think it might work better in like some kind of visual medium, like a movie or show or comic book or something, just because it is all color based. But yeah, I like this book. There's still 3 more things to rank here, but this definitely gets fourth place. Next, I'm gonna go back to Arcanum Unbounded, and we're gonna talk about the Emperor's Soul. I already talked a little about what is so special about that story, and I think I don't need to say too much more than I did in my introduction, but I like the character. I like the magic system. He doesn't. It never slows down because of how short it is. Whereas even though this takes place in the same world as Elantris, I think it's a much tighter story because it's a novella instead of a novel, and I think the at the end of the day, even though a lot of the messages in Elantris are pretty hopeful and optimistic, I think this is a lot more the kind of theme that I enjoy, the kind of what makes a person, how do other people around someone influence them, what is the kind of artistic value in an individual's soul. So yeah, really good stuff. It's the first novella in here, and it's The Emperor's Soul. Comes in third place. And then I'll talk about the last two together. I already kind of advertised that they're two of my favorites, at least so far. Still have Mistborn Era 2, Stormlight. I have all that good stuff to read. But really, it's Well of Ascension and Hero of Ages. I think he just knocked it out of the park. He kind of took the decent foundation he set up with the first Mistborn book, The Final Empire, and he dove into some themes and elements of that world that were things that I was hoping he would explore, but I wasn't sure that he would, and he totally did and totally delivered on them. Some of the species and subspecies of this world, what they are, where they live, how they operate, which god they serve or are part of in a way, all really fascinating stuff. And then how each novel kind of explores a little more deeply one of the three sort of distinct different magic systems of the world. By the time you get to the third one, you're pretty sure you know some of the stuff about that third one, the kind of goriest, most disturbing of all of these magic systems. And we've been getting hints about it all throughout books 1 and 2. So by the time you get here, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that totally makes sense. And then the Furukami, I think it's interesting. I think it's elevated by the fact that my favorite character in the series is Sazed. I'm not sure how you say his name, but if you've noticed my enjoyment of how Sanderson tries to kind of bring up these questions of faith and worship, Sazed is really kind of the focal point of all of that, all of those religious questions, religious doubt, and fear and anxiety over, when people hit those moments of crisis of what if what I believe isn't true, and I mean, personally, not to get too much into my own life, I'm not a particularly religious person, so these are questions I just really I'm not familiar with at all, and for Brandon Sanderson to introduce them to me with such compelling characters like Sazed, and for Sazed to be much more prominent in these two books than he was in the first one, really, really drew me to these and really kind of kept bringing me back, thinking, okay, I enjoyed this section where we're reading about whatever, where we're reading about I don't know, lore and whatnot. We're reading about politics and the vote coming up. But when are we going to get back to the next Sazed chapter? When are we going to kind of see what he's struggling with? Maybe there's a romantic thing he's going through. And maybe he's in debates about his faith-based optimism versus someone else's science, more realistic, practical-based optimism. And it's such a great character. There's a ton of great characters in this trilogy, specifically these two books. I should give a shout out quickly to Spook, who and by the time you get to the third book, his sort of storyline really elevates this. I wasn't sure how Sanderson was going to structure the conclusion, and I'm not sure I've ever seen the final entry in a story split up the cast as much as and for as long as Sanderson did here. I think it actually worked really well, even though I think typically authors and storytellers and, you know, movies, TV shows, they often use like the second book to send people off on their own journeys and let's get to see all these characters grow and change and learn things and then come back together for the big conclusion. That's not exactly what he did here, and I really respect him for that sort of unique structural choice. Also, the ending is pretty epic and pretty grand. And I like the choices he made. I think in the end, it's still something I think about. If that means anything, it means a lot to me that I still think about who winds up in what positions of power and sort of ultimate power, and kind of how this world might work going forward. I'm really interested to read Mistborn Era 2, even though from what I understand, it's quite different, pretty far, if I'm not mistaken, a few millennia in the future from this. So I'm not sure how much or how connected that's going to be to how things wrapped up here in this, my favorite Mistborn book. Oh yeah, I might totally not have mentioned that. If I'm going to, split hairs and rank these, I would give Will of Ascension place 2 and Hero of Ages place 1. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much my ranking. I'll hold them up here real quick. I'll kind of set this aside because it's not as... I haven't finished it all, and those short stories and novellas didn't stand much of a chance. Just remember, I really liked Emperor's Soul. The other two were fine. But with the novels, this is how I would rank them. Top is Hero of Ages, then Will of Ascension, then Warbreaker, then Elantris, then Mistborn, the Final Empire. Thank you for watching, and if... based on what I've talked about here, if anyone has any ideas of which future stories, which parts of maybe Stormlight Archive or Mistborn Era 2, or maybe even which of the other stories in here, maybe the White Sand graphic novels, if anything I've mentioned here leads you to believe I might really enjoy or maybe really dislike certain things about those other kind of sub-series in the Cosmere, please let me know below. And if you enjoyed my video and my ranking, please like and subscribe. Thank you.